How often do your kids say, "Mom, I'm bored"? A new study shows that screen time is actually increasing boredom in kids, but it's really hard to avoid screens.
Looking at how often and how long, we're looking at attention and how kids are able to entertain themselves.
We talked to a pediatric psychologist who spends most of her time working one-on-one with kids in school about the right balance to strike at home and how boredom is actually beneficial.
Giving into the screen means that I'm sacrificing something else, a skill that they're not learning or a connection.
We also highlight a story about a single mom who sacrificed not only for her kids, but others across the globe. It's a story you won't want to miss.
We learned that she had been sending $2 a month to some organization to adopt a kid in Africa.
That's today on Mom Squad. Hi everyone, thank you for watching Mom Squad. I'm Maureen Kyle. Considering there's no live audience here, I'm guessing that you're watching this from a screen. We have screens in our hands at all times, and in many cases, so do our kids. As a parent, I'm sure that you're mindful of screen time at home, but when they're off, I bet you hear, "I'm bored." An annual survey of teens out of the University of Michigan found that boredom rates were increasing. It started during the pandemic, but those surveys said that social media was a big reason. In a separate survey by One Poll of kids ages 3 to 12, they said it took about 33 minutes for the kids to get bored. Now here's the thing, boredom is actually good for our kids. In fact, it's critical to their creative thinking. One of the experts that we've talked to before on Mom Squad is Dr. Lisa Ramirez with Metro Health in Cleveland. She sees patients mostly in a school setting, so I wanted to get her take on all of this. Lisa, thank you so much for being here.
It's always so fun
I
to be
think anytime we talk about kids and screen time, every parent out there wants just more information because it's changing rapidly every day what our kids are in front of. But I found this study so fascinating that it's correlating with boredom. I mean, I remember when I was a kid, I would go, "I'm bored." But are you seeing, when you're in and out of schools and seeing patients, are you seeing kids with increased boredom?
So I think yes and no, right?
Okay.
So boredom, and I think think back to anxiety, right? Anxiety's gotten a bad rap, right? I think we've talked about that, right?
Yeah.
It's when it becomes a problem, right? So boredom has been around forever, and like you said, boredom is not a bad thing. It actually can be a really good thing with the right, supports and structure because it can help kids think about their creativity and learn patience. What we're starting to see though is that I think the increase in saying they're bored, but also not having the ability to think about how to fill their time with something outside of a tech, social media, a phone, something technological, screen, right? That's what we're thinking about. So the boredom itself is not what worries me. The word bored, I hear it all the time in my house. I'm sure I say it a few times too.
Yeah.
It's not the word, it's really what it's communicating. And that's the important part. And in the article, I liked the way they kind of framed looking at how often and how long, we're looking at attention and how kids are able to entertain themselves.
Right. That makes so much sense. Thinking into my own house, if they immediately go for a computer, we don't have smartphones yet, we're not at that age, but they go for the computer that we have for school. And they like to play games and it has to be educational, but the second I'm like, you can't play that, then it's like, well, what do I do? Right. There's so much to talk about here. Let's start with just any parent who finds themselves in that moment. Because I don't know if I'm handling it the right way, where I'm like, you have a basement full of toys. It almost becomes like a weird argument right away. But what should we be doing as parents when we're finding ourselves in the situation where kids are just immediately going to the screen, when it's taken away, then it's I'm bored?
Yeah. First of all, I think I want to acknowledge that, you mentioned the should and the are we doing it right? Are we doing it wrong? There is so much stress right now on parents, higher than ever before. So I just want to take that off the table. Right?
All right, you're making me feel better. Thank you.
And even if it's not kind of ideal, right? There are often ways to sort of repair or just, think about things doing differently. So I wanted to just acknowledge that because I'm hearing that all the time is I feel like no matter what I'm doing it wrong, right? So, I think we have to think about when those opportunities are presenting themselves and how we're responding, right? So let's say, your daughter comes up to you and says, Mom, I'm bored. It's not unlike asking for junk food, right? I mean, kids ask all the time on the summers when they're home, right? They want, I'm hungry. I don't want all of those healthy foods, right? I want what's in the pantry that I'm not supposed to have all the time. And I think in some ways, I think of tech use similarly, right? They're gonna ask for the bag of whatever or that candy or, and it's how we respond to that and the structures that we're putting in place. So I think all the way back to even, when I look around sometimes in restaurants and I look at meal times, and there's never judgment, right? And I've certainly done it before, but that there are times where you just want to eat your sandwich, you want to eat your pasta, and so you pull out maybe your phone for your little one, and then they're watching something while you're eating your food, right? And so I think we need to look at how we are encouraging and when to consume, right? Like anything that's either technology and or what we're putting in place so that our kids learn to tolerate that boredom and learn to embrace their creativity. And also, I think one of the things that is really important is you have to know your child, right? So in my house, I have two, right? And one of them has always been totally fine at entertaining themselves, right? So they're gonna come, they're gonna ask for the screen or the TV or whatever, and if I say no, they may huff and walk away, and then they're playing by themselves or with a friend. I have another one who's kind of less able to do that, genuinely. And so sometimes, it would be easy for me to say, you know what, I need to get this done, I'm cooking dinner, here's a screen. Certainly have done that in the past, but also I realized like that one needs a little bit more connection sometimes and a little bit more guidance, but also giving into the screen means that I'm sacrificing something else, a skill that they're not like learning or a connection, right? So if I need to get dinner done with that particular child, I'm gonna invite them to join me maybe and cut something up, or sit there because then, they're thinking about measurement, they're thinking about, how to cut something. And so we start to think about what we're sacrificing and the quality, and that's really, really important. We're less focused now on the quantity of the screen time and more how it's being used and what it's replacing.
I like how you put that too about like connecting with them. And I have to imagine at first, a kid might be like, no, I don't want to cut vegetables. Right. I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. How do we, I don't want to force it either, because I don't want them to think of this as I'm forcing them to do something they don't want to do. But that connection, like how do we foster that? Does it have to be in little bits as they're resisting? I'm thinking of it as like when we hand them broccoli and they're like, I hate this, but you keep giving it to them until they, finally are like, okay, it's not that bad.
Well, and we have to think about choices, right? So again, the one child, if I say, you can't have the screen right now, would you like to join me and chop this broccoli for me? That one is going to be like, no, I'm good. Like, I'm going to go pick up my book or, whatever. But the other one, might say, I don't want to do that, but we have now a list because it's really hard for that one to on their own think about what to do. But if I give in, because that's the asking and the asking, that's going to set the bar that if they're sort of, I don't want to use that word, but persistent enough that eventually I'll give in to that. And that's kids' jobs. They do that. They do that with tech. They do that with food. They do that with going to the friends' houses, right? I mean, they're really good at that. They ask and they ask and they ask. And so it's really important how we're responding. And if we know that in our family or in your family, or, that the sacrificing or that we don't want to replace connection or playing outside or that creativity with screens, then we do need to have ideas of things that they can do alternatively. So sometimes I'll say, the screen's off the table, it's a non-negotiable. My kids know, like, we're not having this conversation, but here are all the things that either you can think about doing, I can do with you in the moment, if I can. Sometimes I don't have the time to do that. Board games are huge. That one loves board games, and so if I have the time to sit down and do a board game, that's usually, that's gonna go a long way, but I don't always have the time to do that. So then there's other things that they can do, and creativity and tolerating that alone time and understanding how to fill time is a really important skill. And so it may be uncomfortable for us, but sometimes I'll say like, choose your hard. That's a phrase I use a lot, both myself, my kids, we have to choose our hard. And so sometimes it's hard as parents now to think about how to help build that structure, how to help build those skills, but then it's gonna be harder later when they're even older and can't do that on their own.
Right.
So, our job is not to make things easy, it's to prepare them, and so sometimes I think that's sometimes the choice.
Yeah.
And I think back to kind of that restaurant out, it's hard to think about how to engage and entertain your child, especially when they're tired. But there are ways we can do that don't involve screen time. And there are some times where, you just have to pull it out. And as long as there's balance, that's at least what we ask for, because it's never gonna be perfect.
Yeah. While you're on the subject of balance, how would you recommend we do balance, like hours of screen time? I know before the show we were kind of talking about how that might have changed a little bit. It's a gray area for every family, but what should we be thinking about in terms of how much to allow in general? I know it's going to vary kid by kid, but I mean, what should we be thinking about?
Well, there are a lot of factors, and it used to be, I think I mentioned that, we used to think about it as under 2 should have no access to screens, and it really, even after that, shouldn't be more than 2 hours. And there's a lot more texture now, and I think, we talked about how the Academy of Pediatrics has a whole center for excellence with toolkits, that I can give you if you want to, share with your viewers on thinking about how to have these conversations, how to set. They even have a family media toolkit that you can have conversations around, and worksheet you can fill out. And so, you have to know your child in your context. So some children have to do hours of homework on a computer. That's the structure, right, of school, or writing a report, and that starts young sometimes. Think COVID, they were on their screens a whole lot. And so limiting in that context is a lot harder, and so when you think about, maybe you have a child who's really into teaching themselves the guitar, and a lot of what they're doing is looking at YouTube videos or something and teaching their guitar. That is creativity, right? And that is thinking about looking and trying things out and having that tolerance for failure, not learning those chords. So there is quality that can happen. And so tech is not inherently bad, and even social media is not inherently bad. It's how we're using it and how we're consuming it. If you're doing it together, you're watching things together, talking about things, that can be good quality too. So it's really keeping an eye on what we don't want, just like with the junk food metaphor, we don't want all junk food. And so if your child is consuming some of that tech and some of those screens, I had one child who read all the Percy Jackson books, and then they watched Percy Jackson. Now they kind of binge, but it was reinforcing, and they happened to be learning, Greek mythology in school. So in that moment, I'm like, that's probably more tech than I would have allowed at any one time, but I don't feel bad about it because there's some context around it,
Right.
So I do think it's intentionality of looking at why they're consuming and what they're replacing it with, and are we giving them those opportunities to also have time outside, social time with friends, family, because that's, we talked about the 5 C's that the Academy of Pediatrics has, is that crowding out piece of what are they losing or what are they sacrificing, and we need to hold ourselves accountable to that as well, because the modeling is huge. What are we crowding out by replacing things with that screen and tech time? It's not all bad, but we need to be thoughtful about it.
Coming up, we talk to Dr. Ramirez about ways to connect and foster creativity that doesn't require a screen. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Being bored is actually good for all of us. So why is it that the moment we feel bored, we reach for that phone or we flip on some sort of screen? My guest today is pediatric psychologist Dr. Lisa Ramirez with Metro Health to talk about how to encourage activities that foster creativity and critical thinking. I want to talk about those other things that are getting crowded out. Because, and we started this conversation talking about when kids are saying, I'm bored. How important is it for them to have the exercise of, and I'm kind of predicting the answer already, but the ability to go say, I'm bored, all right, I have a box of crayons here. Why are all the other things that are getting crowded out, the outside time, the creativity, why is that critical for them?
So you might be surprised if I told you that one of the most important predictors, or powerful predictors, I should say, of sort of success later in adulthood, if you look at children, is creativity and creative play. So there's actually a professor at Case that studies this. And that's surprising to a lot of people, right? More important than some other factors like intelligence or, is really that ability to be creative and think creatively. And so, sometimes we don't realize the consequences of things, right? Like when we put babies on their back, sometimes crawling was delayed, and so now we're seeing that if there's an easy way to fill time, then there's not forced ability to be creative in how kids are interacting and how they're feeling. So, think about, before we had, I think about playing with my cousins when I was little and the games that we made up, right? I mean, or the talent shows we'd put on, right? Because we had nothing else to do. But if we had tech back then, we wouldn't be doing that. I remember doing Ice Ice Baby in front of, with my cousins, but there's a lot that goes into it. There's the problem solving, the conflict resolution, right? That happened when who's going to get this part. And so we don't realize that all of those pieces of the creative play, the, socialization, that gets crowded out. But yes, boredom, leading to creativity and understanding the things that you like and how you fill your time is super important. I even find myself, I'm waiting in line at the grocery store, I pull out my phone, right? Instead of looking around me, instead of knowing what's going on, there's a mindfulness that we're losing. And sometimes, I'll say it's the difference between being present in plugging your phone in and charging it and just unplugging it and letting it. And that's often what happens is if it's junky consumption of that tech, then it's not really filling us and creating some of those skills that are really important for development and to have in life.
Right. I had heard one time too that, the waiting in, for the dentist, you go to the doctor's office, the dentist's office, and you're sitting there waiting and I see people give their kids the phone or there's a TV on even in the waiting room. But that's inhibiting their ability to learn patience. So, but at the time, it was like the tech's everywhere. Are there exercises? You brought up mindfulness, and I see articles about how to teach your kid mindfulness. I'm like, I don't know if I know mindfulness. So how do we, because it's all around, and you can't help it, you go to these offices and there's TVs on, how do you encourage that mindfulness and that patience at home and in your own home?
Modeling is huge, right? And so in that moment, right, you give your child the phone, you're actually missing out on an opportunity to have a conversation with your child, And so maybe it doesn't have to be a how was your day at school, but if there's something on or you pick up a magazine, right, those are social interactions that are actually really, really important. So I think, it's easy to say, the child says, Mom, can I have your phone? And you're thinking, but I really wanted to scroll because there's this news story that I'm interested in. And you can say, you know what, I actually just want to spend some time with you. Let's both put the screen away, and we'll, it depends how old they are. Little ones love games like I Spy, 21 Questions, and older, there are conversations you can have. But we were talking about this on the way in. There's limited time that you have, and so thinking also about your own ability to tolerate not filling that space, but it's skills there too. So it's not always inherent. We do have to practice it, but it's not only the kids right now that are losing out on that patience. We're doing it as well. And so we can't have a double standard in that sense. And I think we have to be cognizant of that also and have conversations. So at the dinner table, everybody should put tech away. And kids, are good about calling you out. Hey, you said no tech. Why are you allowed to be on your phone? And that's a valid question,
Yes.
And so there are lots of opportunities to think about, if I wasn't on this phone, what would I be doing instead, even as adults? And in childhood, that's even more important.
Yeah. I was volunteering at their school last night. We were sorting uniforms for a sport. And I was with the other mom who's I'm texting her something and she was texting me something and my daughter was helping. She goes, why are adults on their phones all the time? And it was so eye-opening. Right. I was like, well, I'm sending her a message, but that's what she's seeing is that adults are on their phones all the time.
Right.
And like I said, we don't have a cell phone for her. She's just too young, but that's, when you say modeling, I think we're on our phones more than we even realize.
It's very true.
Yeah.
And then as soon as she does eventually get a phone, then the idea is, well, that's what we do. We're just on
that's
it all
normal.
the time. That's normal.
Yes. I'm going to lob this one at you, only because I don't think it's too out of the realm. But again, I must have been scrolling on my cell phone. And I saw something pop up where it said that kids now, kids 2 generations ago, were watching what adults were doing and were involved in everything the adult was doing. And now, I forget how they put it, where it's now we, parents, the way society's set up, are constantly, it's flipped. It's like we are watching what the kids are doing constantly. We're coaching all their things. We're signing them up for everything and standing on the sidelines where my grandma's generation, she was in the kitchen helping, like what you used as an example of chopping vegetables. They learned how to adult from adults, and they're not learning that from us anymore.
Right.
Like, are you seeing examples of that when you're in and out of schools and just the way things are set up now?
Well, I think it's a tough balance, right? I do think that there's much more awareness of what our kids are doing at all times now, Life 360, you know, I mean, and understand, and kids don't have the same privacy that they used to, which is controversial, right? Thinking about that, because we do have to protect them, but there's not, what's actually happening sometimes is undermining like our confidence that they actually can make good decisions, can be responsible, can go to the grocery store by themselves, right? Granted, there's some risks depending on, you know, where you live or how far things are associated with that and knowing your child, but we are kind of undermining that just a little bit. And then I think that in doing that and in access to so much, that I think there's not an appreciation that in us watching them, we're not actually living we're not being that modeling, right. You know, so, sorry, I got distracted there just for a second. And so I do see now more so that the spotlight, instead of us, you know, living our lives and bringing along and including children, right, and doing things that there's much more a hyper focus and a spotlight on everything that they're doing, which is hard. Yeah. But in some ways, I think it's hard because we can't always monitor what they're doing digitally, which is the place that actually we do need to be worried about their safety. So I think, you know, I've heard this said other places that we've sort of, you know, taken away that independence in real life, but given more independence in the virtual world. Yes. Which isn't great. I will say that, right? We do need to be careful in monitoring about what's happening because, you know, when you think about stranger danger, it's actually much more likely to happen in a virtual platform than it is, you know, in the real world, in real life, as they say, you know. So I am seeing that, and as we're hyper focused and really calling out a lot of the behaviors, we're not able to do that modeling, and that's where the stress comes in. And we know that adult well-being and like mental health is really, really important. And right now we're more stressed than we ever have been. And I think that's playing out in both ways. So there's really interesting factors right now where I think if we can create communities and having these conversations and saying it's not perfect, we just need good enough. And also let's make sure that we're giving well-rounded social interactions, abilities for boredom, which is huge. Boredom is important.
Dr. Lisa Ramirez, thank you again for a great conversation. Coming up, how a single mom on welfare ended up inspiring a mission that now helps thousands of kids across the country. It's a story that you won't want to miss. Earlier this month, actor Steve Carell surprised hundreds of high school students in Los Angeles by promising free prom tickets to anyone affected by the wildfires. The organization footing the bill is called Alice's Kids. As if that gesture isn't heartwarming enough, the story behind Alice's Kids will truly bring a tear to your eye. Sean Martinelli from our DC station has the story.
Here we go.
Over his life, all sorts of titles followed Ron Fitzsimmons.
I've always been an executive director of something, or a campaign manager, or a legislative assistant.
None of which topped the distinction of being Alice's kid.
She would always call me Ronnie.
Alice Fitzsimmons raised Ron and his two siblings alone.
Around 1962, my father abandoned the family, and it forced us to rely on the New York State welfare system. So we became known as the welfare family.
A label Alice tried every day to go away.
She hardly had any money, but then she'd go out and make a few extra dollars so we can get a Christmas gift, even if there wasn't a Christmas tree.
Later in life, Alice refused any help from her kids. She lived and worked in a Long Island, New York motel until her passing.
And we went to her room and we found receipts. And we learned that she had been sending $2 a month to some organization to adopt a kid in Africa.
More than anything, that simple generosity stuck with Ron. It followed as he retired from politics and became a substitute teacher.
And there was a girl in the corner crying. And I said, went to her friend. I said, what's wrong with Latrice? She said she can't go to the prom. I said, why not? Well, it cost $50.
Ron remembered his own childhood and paid for the ticket. Then he did something much more.
And that's kind of what led to the creation of Alice's Kids.
That's the nonprofit Ron and his sister Laura started in honor of their mother. The concept is simple.
Student works but can't afford our field trip. Right here.
Teachers from across America reach out on behalf of kids who need something. It could be a field trip fee or new shoes.
We pay for those little things. Our average grant is about $100. Small things that are still very important to their self-esteem.
In 2024 alone, more than 10,000 kids were helped. In all of them, Ron sees himself.
Thank you for your donation, because there could be a chance I didn't join band if it wasn't for you. Just lifting them up a little bit, that's sometimes what kids need, just a little bit of a lift.
A little lift that can make a mighty impact. Look no further than Alice's kid.
It's a sad story, but now I can smile when I think of Alice.
Thank you to Sean Martinelli for that story. Anyone who works directly with kids can request a grant through Alice's Kids, and it can be for any need of a child. Thank you for watching Mom Squad today. I'm Maureen Kyle. You can catch all of our episodes streaming on your local news app, or you can watch on the Mom Squad YouTube channel. We'll see you right back here next time.